Charles Darwin and On the Origin of Species. In the long and restless history of human thought, few figures have cast as long a shadow as Charles Robert Darwin. The publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 not only transformed biology but redefined humanity's place in the natural world. This moment was not a sudden lightning strike of revelation but rather the culmination of a life shaped by curiosity, exploration, and relentless observation. To understand Darwin's work, one must first understand the man himself, a gentle yet determined figure whose legacy would shift the foundation of science, philosophy, and religion. Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, England, into a wealthy and intellectually vibrant family. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a well-known physician, poet, and natural philosopher who had already speculated on evolutionary ideas in his work Zoonomia. Charles's father, Robert Darwin, was a successful physician, and his mother, Susanna, came from the Wedgwood family of pottery fame. These familial connections gave young Charles a life of comfort, security, and access to education that many of his contemporaries could scarcely imagine. From an early age, Charles exhibited a keen interest in the natural world. He collected beetles, stones, and shells with obsessive fascination, finding more joy in observing animals and plants than in formal education. However, his academic career began without distinction. He first attended the University of Edinburgh to study medicine, following his father's wishes, but found the experience intolerable. The surgical procedures disgusted him, and he found the lectures dry and uninspiring. Nevertheless, it was in Edinburgh that he first encountered the radical ideas of evolution through Robert Grant, a Lamarckian biologist and enthusiastic advocate for transmutation of species. Though Darwin later distanced himself from Grant's radicalism, the seed had been planted. Eventually, Charles was sent to Christ's College, Cambridge, to prepare for a life in the clergy, another career choice favored by his family. Ironically, this redirection proved more fruitful than medical school. At Cambridge, he met influential mentors like John Stevens Henslow, a botanist who would become his lifelong friend and supporter. It was Henslow who recommended Darwin for a position that would change the course of his life, the unpaid role of gentleman naturalist on HMS Beagle, a survey ship commissioned to chart the coasts of South America and the Pacific. The voyage of the Beagle began in December 1831 and lasted nearly 5 years. It was during this time that Darwin transformed from an enthusiastic amateur into a serious naturalist and scientific thinker. The journey took him to Brazil, Argentina, Tierra del Fuego, the Andes, the Galapagos Islands, and other exotic locales, and everywhere he went, Darwin observed, sketched, collected, and noted with meticulous care. The most famous stop on the voyage was the Galapagos Islands, a small archipelago in the Pacific Ocean. Here, Darwin noticed that different islands hosted slightly different forms of animals, particularly finches and tortoises. Though he did not immediately understand the implications, these differences would later become crucial evidence in support of his theory. Why should island populations, separated by only a few miles, differ in such consistent ways? Could it be that they had originated from a common ancestor and diverged over time in response to local conditions? Other observations puzzled and inspired him. In South America, he found fossils of gigantic extinct mammals such as the Glyptodon, remarkably similar in form to living armadillos. What could explain these similarities across such vast stretches of time? At the same time, he saw the power of geological forces firsthand. Influenced by the writings of Charles Lyell, especially Principles of Geology, which he read during the voyage, Darwin began to view the Earth not as a static creation but as a dynamic planet shaped by gradual forces over unimaginable spans of time. This sense of deep time was essential to Darwin's emerging vision of evolution. It suggested that the Earth was old enough to allow for the slow accumulation of changes in living organisms. By the end of the voyage, Darwin had filled notebooks with observations, sketches, and hypotheses. He was still years away from publishing his ideas, but the raw material was all there. The trip had revealed to him a living world far more diverse, strange, and interconnected than he had ever imagined. And it had sparked a burning question in his mind: How Do Species Come to Be? Returning to England in 1836, Darwin found himself something of a scientific celebrity. His detailed notes and specimens made him a welcome figure among naturalists, and he quickly established connections with leading scientists of the day. Though he moved into a comfortable life as a country gentleman in Down House, Kent, Darwin devoted himself fully to the study of nature. For over 2 decades, he immersed himself in experiments, correspondence, taxonomy, and quiet reflection. By the early 1840s, Darwin had developed the essential outlines of his theory of natural selection. Drawing on the insights of Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, Darwin realized that populations tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. This surplus leads to a struggle for existence, where only those individuals with advantageous traits survive and reproduce. Over generations, these small differences accumulate, leading to the gradual transformation of species. Darwin called this process natural selection, and in its logic lay a powerful, elegant explanation for the origin of species and the diversity of life. It was a theory grounded not in divine intervention or sudden leaps, but in slow, cumulative change driven by the interaction between variation and the environment. But Darwin did not rush to publish. He knew the implications of his theory would be controversial. To suggest that species, including humans, shared common ancestry with other forms of life was to challenge deeply held religious and philosophical beliefs. Moreover, Darwin was a cautious man by nature. He wanted to amass as much evidence as possible, and to anticipate and counter every objection before presenting his theory to the world. He spent years studying barnacles, breeding pigeons, experimenting with plants, and corresponding with scientists across Europe. This immense body of research gave Darwin a level of authority and credibility that few could dismiss, but it also delayed his publication. Darwin might have delayed forever, had it not been for a young naturalist working in the Malay archipelago, Alfred Russel Wallace. In 1858, Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript outlining a theory of evolution remarkably similar to Darwin's own. Though Wallace had developed his ideas independently, the overlap was undeniable. Darwin, devastated by the thought of being scooped, consulted with friends like Charles Lyell and Joseph Dalton Hooker. They devised a plan. Both Darwin's and Wallace's ideas would be presented jointly at the Linnean Society in July 1858. The event went largely unnoticed by the public, but for Darwin, it was a turning point. He resolved to publish his comprehensive work as soon as possible. Within a year, he completed a condensed version of his vast research, titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It was published on November 24, 1859. The book would change everything. When Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published on November 24, 1859, it appeared quietly in the bookshops of London. Yet its contents carried the force of an intellectual earthquake. Within weeks, the book sold out. Within months, it was being debated in drawing rooms, lecture halls, pulpits, and scientific societies across Europe. In the coming decades, it would alter not only the course of biology, but the trajectory of Western thought itself. But what made this book so transformative? And why did it inspire such passionate reactions, both admiration and outrage? To answer these questions, we must look closely at what Darwin said, how he said it, and why his theory of natural selection arrived at a moment when the world was ready, or at least primed, for a new view of life. Though Darwin had been sitting on the core ideas of his theory for over 20 years, On the Origin of Species was anything but haphazard. It was an argument, subtle, cumulative, and carefully built. Darwin did not begin with bold claims or sweeping conclusions, he opened instead with facts drawn from everyday experience, building from what was familiar to what was revolutionary. The book's first chapter, Variation Under Domestication, examines the ways in which humans breed animals and plants to enhance desired traits. Darwin discusses pigeons in loving detail, he had bred them himself, and points out how selective breeding can produce dramatic changes in form and behavior. This was a brilliant rhetorical move, no one could deny that artificial selection worked. From here, Darwin pivots to variation under nature, asserting that similar variation occurs in wild populations, only without the guiding hand of a breeder. If variation is natural and persistent, could not nature itself act as the selector? The central engine of Darwin's theory is introduced in Chapter 3, Struggle for Existence. Here, drawing on Malthusian economics, Darwin argues that organisms produce more offspring than can survive. This overproduction leads to competition, and those individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. These traits, in turn, are passed on to the next generation. Over vast spans of time, this process, natural selection, can give rise to new forms of life, and eventually, new species. Darwin does not rest with theory, he backs it up with chapters of evidence. He examines the fossil record, geographical distribution, comparative anatomy, embryology, and even rudimentary organs. He discusses how isolated populations diverge, how species blend at the margins, and how classification systems reflect evolutionary descent. He anticipates objections: how can complex organs like the eye evolve step by step? And responds to them with patient, detailed reasoning. In the final chapter, Recapitulation and Conclusion, Darwin offers not a triumphant declaration, but a modest reflection on the grandeur of life evolving from so simple a beginning. His prose, though dense in places, carries the weight of long study and quiet confidence. There is nothing polemical or arrogant in Darwin's tone. He offers his readers a new way to see, inviting them to look at nature not as a fixed creation, but as a living, dynamic process. Why did On the Origin of Species resonate so strongly? In part, because the intellectual world was already in motion. The Enlightenment had ushered in an age of reason and inquiry, and by the 19th century, science had become a respected and increasingly professional enterprise. The old idea that species were immutable and specially created was beginning to strain under the weight of new discoveries. Geology had revealed a planet much older than the Bible suggested. Fossils pointed to vanished worlds and extinct creatures. Biogeography revealed curious patterns of distribution that begged explanation. And comparative anatomy showed strange repetitions. Why did whales have finger bones? Why did snakes have vestigial hips? Something was amiss in the static view of life. Other thinkers had proposed evolutionary ideas before Darwin. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had suggested that organisms could pass on traits acquired during their lifetimes, a theory known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, had speculated on evolutionary change. Even Robert Chambers had anonymously published Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation in 1844, a best-selling book that stirred both interest and controversy. But these early efforts lacked the rigorous mechanism that Darwin's natural selection provided. Darwin's theory was not only bold, it was coherent, testable, and rooted in evidence. The scientific reception of Darwin's theory was mixed but energetic. Some naturalists, like Thomas Henry Huxley, later known as Darwin's Bulldog, embraced the theory with enthusiasm. Others were skeptical, not of evolution per se, but of natural selection as the primary mechanism. Some biologists believed in evolution but thought Darwin had underestimated the role of direct divine intervention, environmental pressures, or other non-selective forces. Yet despite disagreement, Darwin had successfully brought evolution into the scientific mainstream. Within a decade, most naturalists accepted that species had changed over time. The debate shifted to how. The religious reaction, however, was far more polarized. The Church of England, in particular, saw Darwin's theory as a direct threat to biblical literalism. The idea that humans shared common ancestry with apes was considered blasphemous and degrading. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce famously mocked Darwin's theory in a public debate with Huxley in 1860, asking whether it was through his grandfather or grandmother that Huxley claimed descent from a monkey. Huxley's alleged retort, "I would rather be descended from an ape than a man who uses his gifts to obscure the truth," may be apocryphal, but it captures the intensity of the controversy. Yet not all religious thinkers rejected Darwin. Some theologians and clergy, particularly in liberal Protestant circles, sought ways to reconcile evolution with faith. They saw natural selection as the method by which God worked through nature. Asa Gray, a Harvard botanist and devout Christian, corresponded frequently with Darwin and became one of his strongest American supporters. The broader public reception was more curious than hostile. The Victorian era was one of popular science, and On the Origin of Species sold widely. Satirical cartoons, public debates, and newspaper editorials brought Darwin's ideas into the homes of ordinary readers. Many were scandalized. Others were thrilled. A few were quietly convinced. The implications of Darwin's work reached far beyond natural science. Philosophers wrestled with what evolution meant for concepts like purpose, meaning, and morality. If life had evolved through blind, indifferent forces, did that mean the universe was meaningless? If humans were not specially created but descended from other animals, what did that say about human dignity? Social theorists, too, leapt on Darwin's ideas, sometimes in ways he would have abhorred. Social Darwinism, a term later applied to theories that justified racism, imperialism, and economic inequality as natural, distorted Darwin's scientific work into a crude political ideology. Thinkers like Herbert Spencer argued that societies evolved through competition, with the fittest rising to dominance. Darwin himself rejected such applications, insisting that natural selection described how species changed, not how human society should be structured. At the same time, Darwin's ideas inspired more constructive reform movements. Some saw in evolution a narrative of progress and potential. If life evolved from lower to higher forms, could human society do the same? Could education, science, and democracy guide us toward a better future? In literature, art, and culture, Darwin's influence was immense. Writers like Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, and Alfred Tennyson grappled with the implications of a godless universe shaped by impersonal laws. Painters and poets found new metaphors in evolution, new ways of depicting change, struggle, and time. The Victorian imagination was forever altered. How did Darwin himself respond to the tumult his book unleashed? Characteristically, he remained at Down House, removed from the public fray, surrounded by his books, experiments, and family. He rarely lectured and almost never debated. His health, always fragile, prevented him from traveling, and he often suffered from chronic illness, possibly psychosomatic, which had plagued him since his return from the Beagle voyage. Yet Darwin was not disengaged. Through his vast network of correspondence, he maintained a steady dialogue with scientists, supporters, and critics. He continued to publish prolifically, releasing books on orchids, climbing plants, insectivorous plants, the emotions of animals, and the formation of vegetable mold by earthworms. His most controversial work, The Descent of Man, 1871, took the implications of origin further, arguing explicitly that humans were subject to the same evolutionary processes as other animals. He explored sexual selection, moral instincts, and the development of intelligence. Once again, he anticipated and addressed objections with characteristic care and modesty. Darwin died in 1882 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton, a remarkable honor for a man whose theory had challenged the religious orthodoxy of his day. By then, the idea of evolution had become entrenched in biology, and Darwin's name had become synonymous with it. In the decades following the publication of On the Origin of Species, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection took on a life of its own. Though Darwin had built a compelling and voluminous case, science is rarely static. New questions emerged. New evidence was discovered. And perhaps most significantly, a field Darwin barely understood, genetics, would ultimately transform and reinforce his theory in ways he could never have foreseen. Evolution itself evolved. This part of the story of Darwin is not only one of affirmation, but of challenge, adaptation, synthesis, and even misinterpretation. Like the living organisms Darwin so meticulously studied, his theory would be shaped by forces outside himself, by new minds, disciplines, discoveries, and debates. By the time of Darwin's death in 1882, most scientists accepted the basic idea of evolution. Species changed over time, the fossil record suggested it, comparative anatomy reinforced it, and geographic patterns of flora and fauna confirmed it. However, natural selection, the heart of Darwin's theory, remained controversial. Why? Because Darwin's theory depended on variation being passed from parent to offspring. But how exactly did inheritance work? Darwin himself didn't know. He proposed a vague theory called pangenesis, which posited that all parts of an organism emitted tiny particles, gemmules, that influenced reproductive cells. But this was speculative and lacked empirical support. At the same time, many scientists embraced alternative explanations. Some continued to believe in Lamarckian inheritance, the idea that traits acquired during an organism's lifetime could be passed on. Others accepted evolution but considered natural selection too weak or slow to explain the complexity of life. The absence of a robust genetic mechanism left Darwin's theory vulnerable. Ironically, while Darwin struggled with the mysteries of inheritance, an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel had already discovered some of the answers. Working with pea plants in the mid-1800s, Mendel had uncovered basic principles of heredity, dominant and recessive traits, segregation, and independent assortment. But his work, published in 1866, was largely ignored during his lifetime. It would not resurface until the early 20th century. In the early 1900s, as scientists rediscovered Mendel's laws, some believed his work contradicted Darwin. Mendel's clear-cut ratios and discrete units of inheritance seemed to support a view of evolution as a sudden process, contrary to Darwin's emphasis on slow, gradual change. Yet as genetics advanced, the picture began to shift. A new generation of biologists, people like Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewell Wright, demonstrated that Mendelian genetics could not only support Darwinian evolution, but explain it in mathematical terms. Traits could be governed by many genes, each with small effects. Variation could persist in populations. And natural selection could act on this variation over time. The result was what historians call the modern synthesis, forged in the 1930s and 40s, a unified theory of evolution that combined Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics. It explained how mutations introduced new genetic variation, how recombination and sexual reproduction shuffled genes, and how populations changed genetically in response to environmental pressures. It brought together fields as diverse as paleontology, systematics, and embryology under one evolutionary framework. This synthesis transformed biology. It explained how complex organs could evolve incrementally. It provided tools for studying populations and species. And it set the stage for molecular biology, which would soon uncover the structure of DNA and the biochemical basis of heredity. Darwin's theory had been vindicated, not only accepted, but strengthened. What had begun as a naturalist's intuition, grounded in observation, had become the foundation of modern life science. The discovery of the double helix structure of DNA by James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953 revolutionized biology yet again. At last, scientists could see the molecular machinery of life, the instructions encoded in nucleotides, the way genes replicated, mutated, and expressed themselves in proteins. Genetics moved from field notebooks to laboratories, and evolutionary biology gained unprecedented precision. Molecular genetics confirmed much of what Darwin had proposed. For example, comparisons of DNA sequences among species revealed evolutionary relationships Darwin had only guessed at. Humans and chimpanzees, for instance, share over 98% of their DNA, a powerful testament to common ancestry. Entire genomes could now be mapped and compared, offering detailed evolutionary histories of life on Earth. Yet as science advanced, so did its complexity. Evolution was no longer seen as a single, linear process but as a rich tapestry of forces, mutation, genetic drift, gene flow, epigenetics, and developmental constraints. One particularly fruitful area of research became evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO, which studies how changes in embryonic development contribute to evolutionary change. Here, scientists found that even small alterations in regulatory genes could produce large morphological shifts, adding limbs, suppressing eyes, or shifting body plans. This helped explain phenomena that puzzled Darwin, such as the sudden appearance of new forms in the fossil record or the parallel evolution of similar traits in unrelated organisms. Evolution was still Darwinian in spirit, but it was now understood as a multi-layered, dynamic process. As Darwin's ideas spread, they were interpreted, and misinterpreted, by people far outside the scientific community. One of the most troubling legacies of this diffusion is the phenomenon of social Darwinism, the application of evolutionary theory to human society, often in ways Darwin never intended and would likely have rejected. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thinkers like Herbert Spencer used Darwinian ideas to justify laissez-faire capitalism, colonialism, and class hierarchy. The phrase, survival of the fittest, actually coined by Spencer, not Darwin, became a moral and political slogan. If evolution favored the strong, then poverty, war, and inequality were not problems to be solved but natural outcomes of the struggle for existence. Such ideas gained traction in both Europe and the United States. In some cases, they were used to promote eugenics, the selective breeding of humans to improve the species. Influential scientists and politicians advocated sterilization laws, immigration restrictions, and even racial segregation, all under the banner of evolutionary progress. The most horrific culmination of this ideology came in Nazi Germany, where evolutionary rhetoric was twisted into a pseudoscientific justification for genocide. The Holocaust was not a product of Darwin's theory, it was a moral and political atrocity, but it nonetheless reveals how scientific ideas, when removed from ethical scrutiny, can be co-opted for evil ends. Darwin himself never espoused such views. While he wrote candidly about competition and variation, he also believed in compassion, cooperation, and moral progress. In The Descent of Man, he argued that sympathy and altruism were vital traits of human evolution. He saw morality not as a contradiction to nature, but as an extension of it. Still, the history of social Darwinism remains a cautionary tale. Scientific ideas must be understood in context, and their ethical implications carefully considered. Today, Darwin's influence is everywhere. His theory underpins fields as diverse as medicine, anthropology, ecology, and computer science. Evolutionary biology informs vaccine development, conservation efforts, forensic science, and even artificial intelligence. It shapes how we understand disease, language, behavior, and the human mind itself. But Darwin's legacy is not merely scientific, it is philosophical, cultural, and even existential. His work invites us to ask deep questions: who are we? Where do we come from? What is our place in nature? Some find in evolution a sense of awe and wonder, a recognition that life is unified by common ancestry, shaped by the same natural forces across eons. Others feel a loss, the dethronement of humanity from its special place in the cosmos, the suggestion that purpose and meaning are human constructions rather than divine gifts. Yet Darwin himself did not see his theory as nihilistic. In the final paragraph of On the Origin of Species, he writes, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity. From so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. This is not the language of despair. It is the language of reverence, of curiosity, of deep time and interconnectedness." For Darwin, evolution was not a reduction of life's mystery, but its unfolding. If On the Origin of Species offered a powerful explanation for the diversity of life on Earth, it did so with a studied restraint. Charles Darwin mentioned humanity only briefly in the book's final pages, writing with deliberate vagueness, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." It was a small sentence with monumental implications. For if natural selection governed the evolution of finches and barnacles, must it not also apply to Homo sapiens? Darwin knew the answer was yes, but he also knew the reaction would be explosive. He held back from publishing a full account of human evolution for over a decade after origin. But in 1871, Darwin finally tackled the question head-on in The Descent of Man, and Selection in Relation to Sex. Here, he explored our species' evolutionary origins, our physical and mental traits, our moral sensibilities, and the forces that shaped human nature. In doing so, he extended his theory to its most controversial conclusion: not only did humans share common ancestors with apes, but the processes that shaped animals, variation, struggle, adaptation, also shaped us. It was a bold, provocative, and at times unsettling thesis. And it marked a new chapter in the Darwinian revolution. In The Descent of Man, Darwin laid out the case that humans were not exempt from the laws of nature. The anatomical similarities between humans and other primates were too striking to be dismissed. Our skeletal structure, our teeth, our hands, even our embryonic development pointed to shared origins. Darwin noted that human embryos had gill slits and tails, vestiges of our evolutionary past. He cited fossil evidence showing intermediate forms between humans and other mammals. But perhaps the most radical claim was that even our mental faculties, reason, language, morality, and emotion, were subject to evolution. These traits, Darwin argued, existed in rudimentary forms in other animals. Dogs showed affection, elephants remembered, monkeys used tools. Human intelligence was greater in degree, but not fundamentally different in kind. This continuity between species, mental as well as physical, was a direct challenge to the belief that humans were uniquely endowed by God with souls, reason, or dominion over nature. Darwin did not deny the uniqueness of human culture or language, but he saw these as products of evolution, not proofs of divine exception. He wrote, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind." This assertion, more than any bone or fossil, struck at the heart of human exceptionalism. One of Darwin's most original, and controversial, contributions in The Descent of Man was the theory of sexual selection. Unlike natural selection, which favored traits that enhanced survival, sexual selection favored traits that increased reproductive success. These traits might be useless or even burdensome in terms of survival, think of the peacock's extravagant tail or the lion's mane, but they flourished because they were attractive to mates or intimidating to rivals. Darwin believed sexual selection played a central role in human evolution. He argued that early humans may have selected mates based on traits like intelligence, courage, or even musical ability. Over time, these preferences shaped the development of the human brain and body. In this way, aesthetic and social choices became evolutionary forces. This idea was radical not only because it introduced subjectivity, taste, desire, beauty, into the machinery of evolution, but because it suggested that evolution was not merely a struggle for survival but also a kind of creative process. It elevated sexual preference to an engine of change. Critics were quick to pounce. Victorian moralists were disturbed by the idea that beauty, courtship, and even love could be reduced to biology. Others mocked Darwin's discussion of male beards or the shape of noses as products of sexual selection. But the core idea, that mate choice can shape species, has since been widely accepted and remains a vibrant area of evolutionary research. Perhaps the most profound and daring part of Darwin's work on humanity was his attempt to explain the origin of morality. How could evolution, so often associated with competition and survival, give rise to selflessness, compassion, and conscience? Darwin argued that morality began with the social instincts common to many animals: affection for kin, the pleasure of company, the distress caused by another's suffering. These instincts, he believed, were the raw material for more complex moral behavior. As human societies grew, individuals who possessed stronger instincts for sympathy, cooperation, and justice were more likely to be trusted, admired, and helped by others, thus increasing their chances of survival and reproduction. Conscience, in Darwin's view, was the voice of these social instincts, refined by reason, memory, and language. He wrote, "The moral sense seems to be the most important difference between man and the lower animals, but it can be explained by the development of the social instincts. This naturalistic view of morality was revolutionary. It challenged the idea that ethics came solely from divine command or rational deduction. Instead, Darwin suggested that morality evolved, as surely as opposable thumbs or upright posture. Many philosophers and theologians were appalled. If morality was a product of evolution, could it still be binding? Was right merely what worked? Did this open the door to moral relativism? Darwin did not pretend to have all the answers, but his work laid the groundwork for a new field, evolutionary ethics, which continues to explore how biology and morality intertwine. Darwin's exploration of the human mind in the descent of man and later in the expression of the emotions in man and animals, 1872, was equally groundbreaking. He argued that not only physical traits but psychological faculties had evolved. Emotions like fear, anger, love, and shame were universal across cultures and had clear parallels in animals. He studied facial expressions, gestures, and body language in humans and animals, collecting photographs and eyewitness accounts. He identified universal patterns, such as raised eyebrows in surprise or bared teeth in anger, and argued that these were inherited expressions rooted in our evolutionary past. Darwin's work prefigured modern psychology, ethology, and neuroscience. Today, researchers still explore the evolutionary basis of emotion, cognition, and behavior, often confirming Darwin's insights. Concepts like theory of mind, mirror neurons, and evolutionary psychology owe much to his foundational thinking. He dared to suggest that the very capacities that humans pride themselves on, art, music, logic, even religion, may have deep evolutionary roots. This did not, in his view, degrade them. On the contrary, it situated them within the grand arc of nature, making them no less beautiful or profound. Despite the scientific advances that followed Darwin, his ideas about human evolution have continued to stir controversy, especially in the realm of education and religion. In the United States, where religious fundamentalism gained strength in the early 20th century, Darwinism became a flashpoint. The most famous conflict came in 1925, with the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. High school teacher John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution in defiance of state law. The trial became a national spectacle, pitting modern science against biblical literalism. Though Scopes was found guilty and fined, the trial exposed the deep divide in American society over evolution, a divide that persists today. Even in the 21st century, debates over evolution remain potent. In many countries, religious groups continue to reject Darwinian evolution, promoting alternatives like creationism or intelligent design. In some classrooms, teachers are pressured to teach the controversy or downplay evolution entirely. This resistance is not purely scientific, it is emotional, cultural, and theological. Evolution challenges certain narratives about purpose, special creation, and humanity's role in the universe. For some, Darwin's vision feels alienating or morally threatening. For others, it is a source of wonder and spiritual awe. Darwin himself was aware of these tensions. Though raised in a religious household, he gradually drifted from Orthodox Christianity, especially after the death of his beloved daughter Annie. He became an agnostic, not a militant atheist, but a man who could no longer reconcile his scientific understanding with traditional religious beliefs. He once wrote, "I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton." He respected faith, but he followed the evidence. In recent decades, our understanding of human evolution has exploded. Fossil discoveries in Africa, Asia, and Europe have revealed a rich and complex story of human ancestry. We now know that Homo sapiens shared the planet with other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others, and that interbreeding occurred. Modern humans carry genetic traces of these ancient cousins. Genomics has revealed astonishing details about our evolutionary past, when we diverged from chimpanzees, how populations migrated and adapted, how traits like lactose tolerance or skin pigmentation evolved in response to environment and culture. At the same time, fields like evolutionary psychology have sought to explain human behavior in terms of adaptive. It has been more than a century and a half since the publication of On the Origin of Species, yet the world continues to reckon with Charles Darwin's legacy. What began as a naturalist's patient observation of life's variety has grown into a framework so vast and influential that it shapes not only our understanding of biology, but the way we think about ourselves, our place in the universe, and the trajectory of civilization. Darwin did not merely change science. He changed the very nature of questions we dare to ask. Where did we come from? What unites us with the rest of life? Are we an accident, or an inevitability? These are not only scientific questions, they are philosophical, spiritual, ethical, and deeply human. As we conclude this exploration of Darwin and On the Origin of Species, we turn to his legacy, how it has endured, evolved, been challenged, celebrated, and woven into the story of the modern world. At the most basic level, Darwin's theory provided biology with its unifying principle. As Theodosius Dobzhansky famously declared in the 20th century, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This statement holds true now more than ever. In the biological sciences, evolution offers not just a historical explanation but a predictive framework. It explains why bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, why viruses like SARS-CoV-2 mutate, why some species go extinct while others flourish. It informs conservation efforts, helping us understand biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. It guides medicine, agriculture, and genetics. From cancer research to climate science, Darwin's fingerprints are everywhere. His work also pioneered a methodology, a commitment to careful observation, testing, skepticism, and openness to change. Darwin's own humility, his admission of uncertainty, his willingness to revise conclusions in the face of new data, these are hallmarks of scientific integrity. In an age where science is often politicized or misunderstood, Darwin remains a model of intellectual courage and honesty. The discovery of DNA, the mapping of genomes, and the rise of computational biology have only enriched Darwin's insights. Though he lacked knowledge of molecular biology, the core of his theory has proven resilient. The elegance of natural selection, the centrality of variation, and the common ancestry of life have all been borne out across countless disciplines. Darwin's ideas have not remained confined to science. They have leapt into the cultural bloodstream, inspiring writers, artists, filmmakers, and philosophers. Evolution has become a metaphor for progress, struggle, innovation, and transformation. The phrase, survival of the fittest, though Darwin used it reluctantly and with care, has entered common language, sometimes inappropriately but always with weight. From science fiction to political theory, Darwin's legacy appears in both overt and symbolic ways. Novels like H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, television shows like Cosmos, and films like 2001, A Space Odyssey all echo Darwinian themes of adaptation, extinction, and the fluid boundary between humanity and nature. In art, Darwin inspired a move away from static idealism toward dynamic realism. Life was no longer a still life, it was a living story, constantly becoming. In philosophy, he prompted re-examinations of ethics, consciousness, free will, and the human condition. Thinkers like Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and Foucault all grappled, directly or indirectly, with the implications of Darwinian thought. Even theology has responded, with some traditions embracing evolution as a means of divine creation, and others rejecting it as incompatible with scriptural authority. In both camps, Darwin has served as a touchstone for reflection, resistance, and reform. Despite its robust scientific foundation, evolution by natural selection remains misunderstood and misrepresented in some circles. As noted earlier, creationist and intelligent design movements have resisted the teaching of evolution in schools, especially in regions where religious literalism holds sway. Often, these objections stem not from scientific critique but from fear that evolution erodes purpose, morality, or human dignity. This is ironic, given Darwin's own deep respect for the mystery of life. He never claimed that evolution answered all questions or eliminated meaning. On the contrary, he spoke of grandeur in the view of life as a process of continuous change, bound by natural laws yet filled with wonder. Another common misunderstanding is the idea that evolution implies progress in a moral or hierarchical sense, that humans are more evolved than other creatures. Darwin rejected this notion. Evolution has no direction, no goal beyond survival and reproduction. A bacterium, in its niche, is as fit as a human is in his. Similarly, some have used Darwin's ideas to justify social or political ideologies, often under the banner of social Darwinism, eugenics, or racial superiority. These applications distort Darwin's science and ignore his ethical humility. Evolution describes what is, not what ought to be. It is not a blueprint for society, but a lens for understanding life. In recent years, the misuse of evolutionary language in discussions of race, gender, intelligence, or sexuality has prompted renewed calls for clarity, nuance, and responsibility in how we communicate Darwinian ideas. Scientific literacy is essential, not only to protect truth, but to guard against prejudice cloaked in pseudoscience. To appreciate Darwin's legacy, we must also appreciate Darwin the man. He was not a conqueror or provocateur. He did not seek fame or controversy. He was a man of deep thought, deep affection, and deep struggle. His notebooks reveal moments of profound doubt, not just scientific but personal. He worried about the pain his ideas might cause his wife Emma, a devout Christian. He wrestled with illness, grief, and the meaning of suffering. He doubted his own powers, questioned his own logic, and often delayed publication for fear of error or harm. And yet, despite these burdens, he changed the world. Not by force, but by patient observation. Not by dogma, but by careful reasoning. Not by shouting, but by writing, with humility, respect, and a quiet conviction in the power of evidence. It is telling that Darwin never claimed final answers. He acknowledged the limits of knowledge. He invited others to continue the work. His theory was not a closed system but an open path, a way of thinking, exploring, and seeking truth. More than 160 years after its publication, On the Origin of Species remains a foundational text, not just for biology, but for intellectual history. Its core ideas continue to resonate. That all life is connected by descent with modification. That nature is not static but dynamic. That complex forms can arise from simple beginnings through natural laws. That change is constant, inevitable, and sometimes beautiful. In a world facing unprecedented challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, technological upheaval, Darwin's insights are more relevant than ever. They remind us that we are part of a living system, shaped by forces older and larger than ourselves. They call us to act not as conquerors of nature, but as its stewards. And on a deeper level, Darwin's work encourages a kind of humility. It asks us to look at the world not with arrogance, but with curiosity. To see in every organism, every fossil, every branching tree of life, a testament to time, resilience, and the slow, patient power of change. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he altered not just the content of science but the structure of thought. He offered a theory that was elegant, terrifying, liberating, and exhilarating all at once. He closed one chapter, the story of immutable design, and opened another, the story of life as a process, a journey, a great unfolding. Today, we live in a world where evolution is not just a scientific principle but a cultural reality. We speak of evolving technologies, evolving identities, evolving societies. The metaphor of evolution has become a language of change. And while some resist this vision, most now live within it, consciously or not. Darwin gave us no creeds, no commandments, no final truths. What he gave us was a framework, a way to ask questions, gather evidence, and seek understanding. He gave us a sense of our place in nature, not above it, not outside it, but within it. His life reminds us that science can be humble and revolutionary, patient and daring, human and universal. His work teaches us that even the most ordinary observations, a beetle, a barnacle, a bird, can lead to the most extraordinary truths. In the end, Darwin did not diminish life's wonder. He revealed it. He showed that from so simple a beginning, a universe of beauty and complexity could emerge, not by design, but by the ceaseless dance of nature's own hand. And in doing so, he changed forever the way we see the world, and ourselves.